This week on The Thinking Muslim, we have ex-Israeli negotiator turned deep critic. Daniel Levy gives us an insider view on how the Israeli regime looks upon the current ceasefire and prospects for a just peace for the Palestinians.
We should listen to what Israel's leaders are telling us. Listen to Trump. When he talks about the strike against Iran, his eyes light up. What happened with Venezuela with the illegal kidnapping of President Maduro.
The Netanyahu government is pursuing its genocidal policy by other means.
And Jalal, I'm very hesitant to use that term even, ceasefire. But Israel did not withdraw from Gaza. Israel did not allow the aid in, as we've said. Israel did not desist from its military operations. It is now exclusively, I would say, reliant on military domination. Europe is crucial to Israel in what I call the 3 Ts. Quarter of Israel's assets are held in European banks. Does anyone talk about freezing those assets? Trump is excited about this awesome toy of American military power and how you can deploy it. The displacement of brown people for white settlement. What's not to like it?
Daniel Levy, welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Thank you for having me, Jalal.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. Now, Daniel, I know you've been doing the rounds and talking about the current prospects for peace and prospects for an enduring ceasefire. And I want to focus on that today in our conversation, as well as really look at the prospects of Netanyahu's government and peace in the region, because, of course, over the last 2.5 years, Israel has really been on a militant path, I would suggest, across the region. So we've got a lot to cover today, but I want to start with the ceasefire itself. Now, we're formally in this first phase, they call it, of the ceasefire. From your perspective, how real is this ceasefire in practice?
And Jalal, I'm very hesitant to use that term even,
Really?
ceasefire. Let's first of all acknowledge that the hellscape of Gaza continues. Mm-hmm. Killing rates in the triple digits, which were staggeringly the norm for the better part of 2 years plus, are not the case. But people are being killed by the Israeli military in Gaza every day. Are we at the height of the starvation siege? No. But do we have anything like acceptable or reasonable living conditions? Absolutely not. Even that minimal commitment in the plan to 600 trucks a day, keeping people just above subsistence level when they've been kept so far below subsistence level for so long, even that has not been met. We're at about 125. So we're at about a quarter of what was committed to. So given that there are daily military operations by the Israelis, I think we're at significantly over 400 Palestinians killed since the so-called ceasefire. The creeping deepening of that Israeli military presence. This is a ceasefire characterized by Israel can do what it wants and call this a ceasefire. We've seen this in Lebanon. So, while not dismissing entirely the absolute need for Palestinians in Gaza to have a little bit of that breathing space, I also don't want to get carried away with a sense of a page having been turned, let alone the claim of the broker of that arrangement, the American president, that after 3,000 years of conflict, here we have peace in the Middle East. And the document itself is extremely problematic. When I say document, I of course refer to the 20 points. And that was subsequently translated. And this was an appalling act, also of complicity by those who went along with it. That gets translated into UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which conditions fundamental Palestinian rights, including the right to self-determination.
I mean, would you go as far as to say that the Netanyahu government is pursuing, through this ceasefire, its genocidal policy by other means?
I think that would, in very significant measure, be an accurate description.
Really?
What you have is the continued displacement of Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
You, of course, do not have the ability of Palestinians to go back to those parts of Gaza still under Israeli direct military occupation, this so-called yellow line that people will be familiar with. Forensic architecture has come up with detailed examination that there are 13 new areas as of the end of 2025 in which Israel has expanded its footprint and its military presence. So not only do you have Palestinians prevented from going back too much of Gaza, they're certainly not allowed to begin to reconstruct. The conditionalities being placed on that are intentionally onerous. You have Israel squeezing Palestinians, and look at the geography here, in particular into areas abutting the Egyptian border. When the main border crossing to Egypt, the Rafah crossing, was opened, it was opened unidirectionally, so for exit only. None of this is circumstantial. None of this is by coincidence. Yeah. Are we in a phase which is more about making life unbearable to tee up the next phase of ethnic cleansing rather than the next phase of outright physical removal by death of Palestinians? I think we should take that very seriously, because we should listen to what Israel's leaders are telling us.
And what are they telling us?
And those in Netanyahu's coalition continue to tell us that Gaza will be resettled by Zionist Jewish Israeli settlers, that there is not a future for Palestinians in Gaza. And they have been caught red-handed in episodes like this so-called Al-Majd NGO, which is being sponsored, is clearly an Israeli front organization that's been exposed by investigations, and is a front for getting Palestinians out of Gaza permanently. Now, I don't think that the big numbers you still have a population, it probably hovers around the 2 million mark. It was 2.3 million on the eve of October 2023. That's not going to lead to the mass physical removal. But the perception Israel wants to create is you have no future here. At some stage, you should seek your future elsewhere. We'll try and facilitate that. I wouldn't dismiss the idea that the attempt to push people into Egypt will be revisited. That was openly discussed as an Israeli governmental plan. Yeah. Even something we may discuss, I imagine, this Israeli recognition of Somaliland has been linked to the physical displacement and the Somaliland administration's agreement to Palestinians from Gaza being taken in by that territory. Again, do I expect that to be a huge numerical undertaking? No, but it's signaling, and there's a similar process in the West Bank. One shouldn't discuss this, though, without acknowledging something that I think is perhaps even more important than everything I've just described in terms of Israeli intentionality, which is Palestinian resilience. Because the other side of that story is, against the backdrop of everything that has been attempted, Palestinians have this relationship with staying on the land, this depth of a sumud, resilience outlook. And I think the Israelis, in many respects, do get it. I think if you peel back the layers, they're aware that you've had a Nakba, you're talking about a second Nakba, you're trying to implement a second Nakba. But there's a Palestinian depth of attachment. It's going to take an awful lot to stop that, which is why I think killing is deployed so ubiquitously. I think who doesn't get that at all, and this is interesting to me, is in the American administration, right, where the combination of the real estate magnate and the settler colonial mindset of especially the people around this American administration. They keep returning to this idea of, hey, you can have a better life somewhere else. Why don't you go there? The idea that people are rooted to their soil. This is their home. And so Trump even returned to it at that Mar-a-Lago just before New Year press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he again talked about Palestinians leaving Gaza. And that's his default place to go.
We came to East Africa for a medical camp. This camp is organized by Baitul Mal. These people have been living with blindness for years. SubhanAllah, some in one eye, some in both. We met a lady yesterday. She had blindness in both her eyes, was supporting 5 kids, and her husband is mentally ill. She performed the surgeries in one eye 3 months back and was here for the second surgery, SubhanAllah. She is the bread earner of her family. It's less than $200. It's one meal for us. It's eyesight for them. Whatever we can do, inshallah, to help will be our privilege. Jazakallah khair.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
So let's talk about the continuation of the ceasefire. Of course, with all the caveats that you mentioned, there is a conversation still ongoing about phase 2 of the ceasefires within the 20 points that were initially proposed. And within that phase 2, there would be an international stabilization force, and one country that is often cited as being called to that would be Turkey. And of course, it seems that Netanyahu resists at the moment any boots on the ground from Turkey whatsoever. I mean, based on your experience, firstly, do you feel that there is any prospect for an international stabilization force in Gaza, or will Netanyahu resist any such measure?
So I think what you have is a thus far successful Israeli attempt to set the terms of the ceasefire and of what happens next in phase B of the ceasefire. So the Israelis being held in Gaza were returned. I would argue as well they should be. There were Palestinian prisoners released, as well they should be. But Israel did not withdraw from Gaza. Israel did not allow the aid in, as we've said. Israel did not desist from its military operations. It downgraded those. And Israel is seeking to make sure that the next phase does not in any way disturb its continued domination of that space. What could disturb that space? That space could be disturbed by a handover to genuine Palestinian governance. I don't know if we're going to discuss this further, but anyone paying attention is increasingly getting exposed to what are very pragmatic if you take comparative conflict elsewhere in the world, historically, liberation movements, under illegal occupations, resistance, etc. What are very pragmatic positions being put forward by the Hamas leadership as to how this can be dealt with. Israel is not interested, and Americans thus far are not interested in pursuing those. And so Israel is hiding behind this question of disarmament. I'll park that for a moment, setting the bar for disarmament in a place that is intentionally, again, unreachable. And the Israeli position is that if we are looking at a force that can be a co-occupier, a co-belligerent in terms of going after Palestinians, thumbs up. That's fine with us. I think they understand that that's unlikely. They managed to establish something in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority where their security forces largely operate in that vein. What you don't have thus far, and I think it will be difficult to change that, is a willingness of countries to go in and say, okay, we'll deploy alongside the IDF to suppress Palestinians. What is not written in the plan, but it's the image that's conjured up when you hear the word international stabilization force or international force, is that presumably the party that has been genocided, who do not have the ability to defend themselves, would be protected by such a force, the Palestinians, and that this force would act in some way as a deterrence to Israeli action. Such a force would bear witness on the ground. They would see how the Israelis act. They would be able to investigate, and Israel would perhaps think twice before killing the troops of third parties. Israel is aware of all of those things, and hence Israel has no interest whatsoever in there being an international force on the ground that at any stage could even emerge to have a mandate where Palestinians are being protected, Israel is being deterred. And therefore, it doesn't want to see this force come about. There's also the issue here of precedent. If you put something on the ground in Gaza, then what's the logic for not having it in the occupied West Bank, in East Jerusalem? And I think that unless this is insisted upon, ultimately that's going to have to include the US, then you will not see an international force that bears any resemblance to what I just described. Of course, it is also linked to Israel's withdrawal from the 58% of plus minus of Gaza now under direct occupation. Again, something that Israel doesn't intend to do. And so instead we're playing this game. And part of the game is what is being called the CMCC. I think it's the Civil Military Coordination Center, a facility inside Israel, largely staffed by the Israeli military and the Americans, with 2-3 dozen other militaries having a very small presence in this building, which was supposed to advance issues like entry of aid into Gaza. It's almost entirely failed to do so. It has led to some friction at a working level between some of these militaries and Israel, but I think the Israelis would say, what a fantastic success. While we are in the International Court of Justice being tried for the crimes of genocide, we have 3 dozen militaries collaborating with us in a center in our territory controlled by us. What a marvelous whitewashing exercise. And I think that's what it is. Shame on those countries who are participating in that. And it also potentially might allow the American president to say, oh, I have my ISF. We got 3 dozen militaries cooperating together. We're doing some fantastic stuff. And just as he may say, we've got our governance for Gaza. We got the Board of Peace. We got Tony Blair, whoever else. So I think that's the game we're playing. And unless and until Israel experiences something it tends not to experience, which is leverage being deployed against it, which is its feet being held to the fire, which is accountability and a challenge to its impunity, unless and until those things happen, the argument that the countries who are engaged in this are making, which is this is the only way to try and improve the ceasefire, that becomes largely irrelevant because you're not actually challenging the Israelis. And for me, the big test, therefore, is accountability. And the first thing I would look at is compensation. Israel destroyed Gaza. Why do we expect Gulf Arab states, European taxpayers, others to make good on that? Absolutely, I want the resources for Gazans to be able to pick up their lives, for Palestinians in Gaza to have a better future, to come from wherever they can come from. But there's one place where we should be saying, this isn't a question of philanthropy. You should be doing this. 1/4 of Israel's assets are held in European banks. Does anyone talk about freezing those assets? Not that I've heard of.
So when we talk about leverage and accountability, we obviously turn to the Americans. And I've got a two-part question here, really. That firstly, there is a perception that Trump is better, in inverted commas, than Biden. Biden was ideologically wedded to the Israeli state policy of annihilating the Palestinians, let's call it that. Whereas Trump is far more transactional and doesn't quite have the ideology that Biden had. And secondly, then, what is the relationship in your mind between Trump and Netanyahu? And you mentioned the Mar-a-Lago press conference that took place between the two leaders. And There was a little bit of pushback, I noticed, in that press conference when Turkey was raised and the second phase was raised. There was a disagreement over whether Turkey should have any presence in Gaza. There was a disagreement on the West Bank, and you could see the body language was somewhat contorted at that point between the two leaders. So in your mind, is there leverage there? And do you believe that there is an attention to the detail maybe within the Trump administration to follow through on this so-called ceasefire plan?
So a lot to unpack.
Please.
So I think my best starting point would be, low bar when it comes to, is this an improvement on Biden? But let's also locate this in a thread of continuity when it comes to US-Israel relationship, the role of Israel in US politics, the successful embedding of Israel and Zionism in a partly a Judeo-Christian, American, also frontier perspective, also settler colonial way of seeing the world. So for many Americans, the displacement of brown people for white settlement, what's not to like it? And I just think we have to be cognitive of that. And then, one can go into how American politics works, campaign finance, the Israel lobby. It's not unique. Look at Big Pharma, look at the gun lobby, but it is certainly a significant player. And then you kind of get to contemporary American politics. And this is interesting. And this has gotten very interesting. And if you want a kind of headline from the last few months, it's, whoa, where did that come from? And boy, has it moved fast when it comes to the fight inside MAGA. Israel first versus America first.
We're talking about Tucker Carlson.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Candice. Even Nick Fuentes. On the
and this is where, for some people, this is an attempt to understand contemporary politics without digging deep enough. So I'm not going to dig deeper and become a fan of Nick Fuentes by any stretch of the imagination. But to think that you can simply dismiss him because the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, super compromised organization says so, you're not getting the rhythm of the debate on the right today. And when Trump cloaks himself in the Mark Levins and the Miriam Adelsons, these are very important pro-Israel influencers by the funders or in the the podcast sphere. I think he's just strengthening the other side. And as I say, when some of those legacy establishment American Jewish organizations, and I would stress that I do not think they are representative of where American Jews are at, but when those legacy organizations go after them in the way they do, I think they're failing. If I kind of step back for a moment, and obviously the thing that they deploy most aggressively and endlessly is accusations of anti-Semitism, sometimes accurate, very often false. I would say that some of these organizations are probably bigger spreaders of anti-Semitism today than the people who they are. Those legacy Jewish organizations, the people who they are accusing that of. But pulling us back into your question, Jalal. So in American politics, you are already deep into a world in which Democrat leadership politics is markedly out of sync with where their voters, where their constituency, certainly where their mobilized activist constituency is at. You saw that in the Biden administration. You saw that in the Kamala Harris campaign, and they paid a big price for it. And I think that is now acknowledged. and you see change on the Dem side. Is it going far enough? Is it fast enough? No. But you look at the polling numbers and they're quite staggering. What you didn't have was that same rupture on the GOP Republican side. And that's what you have today. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But going back to Trump, Netanyahu, Mar-a-Lago, what can we expect from this administration? Yeah. Trump looks at what's going on. He sees it, but he has not shifted gears as a consequence of it. Certainly not yet. And the milieu around Trump, I don't think Trump is steeped in a Zionist worldview like Biden was.
Yeah.
But there are a cohort of Trump whisperers and Trump donors and a Trump echo chamber, which is, first of all. Secondly, Netanyahu is nervous that Trump could turn on him. In many respects, rightly so. Like the 12-day Israeli-initiated military confrontation with Iran, when the president escalated to de-escalate. Success, though, for Netanyahu to pull him in, and then immediately said, and now stop, and used expletives with regard to Netanyahu. But what Netanyahu has thus far done is he has worked overtime to make sure that he's kept Trump close and kept Trump on side. 6 meetings. No one's come close between Netanyahu and Trump in under a year since Trump was sworn in, and Netanyahu now feels very good about the direction of travel of this. Trump, as he has done in several instances, has intervened in domestic Israeli politics, has openly called for and written a letter to the Israeli president to pardon Netanyahu in his multiple criminal trials that are still in court at this moment. And I think we can say this with greater confidence after what's happened in Caracas, what happened with Venezuela, with the illegal kidnapping of President Maduro. Netanyahu, for now, seems to have gotten Trump excited about this awesome toy of American military power and how you can deploy it. Listen to Trump. When he talks about the strike against Iran, his eyes light up. He talks about talking to the pilots. He talks about how that allowed him to reshape the Middle East. That's total nonsense. And you see how excited he was being in that control room in Mar-a-Lago, watching that operation when he talks about that as well. And it feels like the neocons have got their claws deep into Trump. Now, I don't think that's popular. I don't think it's popular with MAGA. So if I belatedly address the bottom line of your question, Netanyahu always wants to make sure that Trump's not veering off script too much, but thus far he will be very pleased with the results because the areas of disagreement largely appear trivial. When Trump and Netanyahu are disagreeing over the West Bank, Netanyahu is successfully saying that's about 70 errant hilltop youth who had a tough upbringing. And don't worry, we'll crack down. That's nonsense. And when Trump says you won't annex the West Bank, that sounds like a big deal. De facto, Israel has gone so far beyond annexation. So Netanyahu and the Israeli system are very good at drawing a line and saying, oh, okay, we won't annex. What are they doing? Destroying Palestinian infrastructure, displacing more Palestinians in the West Bank, especially from refugee camps, tens of thousands, that has been the case at any time since 1967. Trying to dismantle the ability of UNRWA, the UN agency that deals with Palestinian refugees, to function. Expanding settlements, which always happens, but even by Israeli standards, in an intensified way. So this is all manageable. And then you get to the Turkey question. And as long as Netanyahu can put a block on an international force, which, as we discussed, he has done so far successfully, the Israel-Turkey tension will play out in many ways. But it's not yet playing out in ways that are overly concerning to the Israeli side, because the Israelis know America has leverage. In fact, what we see, and here, I just want to pause on this. It's really significant. What this last period has shown whether it's the response in Gaza and the conveyor belt of American weaponry, which Israel was totally dependent on, as well as the political, economic, diplomatic, UN support, or whether it's the Iran 12-day confrontation where Israel was so reliant on it. What this has shown is the unprecedented degree of Israeli dependence on the US. I would argue that is happening at a moment where Israel and support for Israel first has become also unprecedentedly controversial inside American politics, as we just discussed, Tucker Carlson, etc. And in parallel, at a moment where world geopolitics is shifting, and I would argue America is not as powerful. That may sound counterintuitive to people. Maybe we'll discuss that. And the leverage does not just reside with America. And here I don't want to let others off the hook. There are states in the Gulf with significant economic financial relations, significant sovereign wealth funds. They don't deploy those. They could. Europe is crucial to Israel in what I call the 3 T's: trade, tourism, and tournaments. Europe is Israel's largest trade partner. Europe is where Israel gets to show its citizens it's a normal country because you can travel visa-free, even without having to declare that you weren't involved in perpetrating war crimes in the last 2 years. You don't even have to sign a declaration to that effect when you travel to Europe. And the normalcy of being in football tournaments, being in Eurovision. These things matter. It's how a society either receives the signal, everything you're doing is okay, it's normal, or receives the signal, you have a problem because of what you're doing. So I don't want to let others off the hook. And that leverage can then impact America.
You talked about Tucker Carlson and Candace Owen and Nick Fuentes and this sort of split within the MAGA movement, or at least the MAGA movement versus the neoconservatives. I mean, I'm fascinated by this because until now it did seem like there was a growing chorus, I suppose, of anti-Israel feeling within the broader conservative Republican movement in America. Now, Venezuela, and the actions of the government in Venezuela tend to tell me that maybe MAGA isn't as strong as we had imagined it to be. At least the MAGA base is as strong because, of course, MAGA is all about non-intervention. It's about America first. Like, in your mind, how important is this trend? And of course, we're talking about Palestine. How important is this trend in holding the administration to some form of accountability when it comes to its policies on Israel-Palestine?
I think if I'm going to be as kind of upfront about this as I can in January of 2026, my response would be it's too soon to tell.
Right.
Because this is a phenomenon of recent vintage. A year ago, we wouldn't have thought. 6 months ago, even 3-4 months ago, we wouldn't have thought we would be in this place in terms of this debate inside the MAGA world when it comes to Israel. Venezuela looks to me like, first of all, what I said, that Trump has a little bit fallen in love with how to play with these big, powerful, destructive, illegal often use of these toys. And it feels like chunks of the administration are being co-opted by certain interests. Of course, you have the overriding interest of the self-enrichment of the family and the hangers-on, etc. Yeah. But for a cohort of Marco Rubio and some of those neocons, the Western Hemisphere, Central South America are always the key playground. Iran, Contra. Going back to so many interventions, so go back even further, go back to Allende and Pinochet in Chile. And here you have a president that is apparently willing to go along with that. West Asia, Middle East, Israel, the strategy for a clean break paper, if people want to look that up, the neocons when Netanyahu first came into power, in 1996. So there have been these attempts, and it feels like there's a degree of capture of that. And therefore, a lot of the attention is now, what does he do next with Iran? The Israeli agenda is quite transparent in that respect.
Another strike on Iran.
And not just another strike. This time they have put front and center the thing that was the subtext last time, which is regime change.
Right.
You can own, and you would, I imagine, be somewhat surprised, maybe not, at how this has played out in the Israeli media in the last few days. The degree of hyperventilation around, wow, Maduro was so easy. Headlines that supposed leaks, that Khamenei, the Iranian leadership, have already been in talks with Russia over where they will flee to. Fine. Are they going to throw every asset they have at this? Do they have significant penetration and capability to try and sow discord inside Iran? The regime itself, just like in Israel, the regime isn't very popular for many reasons. The regime in Tehran isn't popular with much of the public. So are they going to try and undermine that? Yes. Will they be successful? Will they draw the Americans into this? Look, they got Trump to say, locked and loaded, if you harm the protesters. Not an insignificant thing. But here is that question inside MAGA. Something he didn't do last time. America did one night of bombing on Iran. Something, it's unclear whether they'll do in Venezuela, but the narrative seems to be, we will run this, but what I really mean by that is we'll take their oil. Sellable to MAGA, perhaps. This is an American interest. You're going to see the benefits, as if they're all major shareholders in American oil companies, by the way, or refineries off the Texas coast where, you know, heavy Venezuelan crude is apparently going to be best refined. But I think he has a real problem. And you see this fight on for MAGA. But I think there's another way of looking at this. One way I look at the situation with Israel is that we are deep into the overreach of the Zionism project.
Okay.
That it's taken on more than it can actually manage. That to the extent to which there was the successful management of its place in the region and of its dispossession of Palestinians, it was because they were able to place an incremental and pseudo-pragmatic veneer on this, including, hey, actually, there's a peace process, guys. The abandonment of that veneer, the extension of the ambitions of that project, the hegemonic, military domination-driven ambitions of that project, feel to me like they are beginning to boomerang. And I say that in the context of us talking about the US, because this also feels to me like this could be at least partially the undoing of this Trump second term. I don't think his base are happy with the fact that he's spending more time on international affairs than on dealing with domestic bread and butter issues. His obsessive pursuit of the Nobel Peace Prize is not something that I think echoes positively. And where I want to go with this is on something like Venezuela. Are they actually going to invest heavily there? Are they going to run it, as he has said? If not, and if you've simply done a very Insta-friendly, a very TikTok-friendly capturing of Maduro, but his people are still in charge, people are going to see through that was a game. And even the whole national security strategy paper that was released towards the end of 2025, and this emphasis on the Western Hemisphere,
the Trump corollary,
the Don Roe doctrine, right? So Trump, American domination in that sphere, and let's face it, they've had election wins in Chile, in Honduras. He's intervened quite heavily in some of those politics. They propped up Milei to the tune of billions and helped him in a midterm election. They tried to intervene in Brazil on Bolsonaro. Obviously, big headline, what they've now done in Venezuela. I look at that, that's interesting. Is America being pushed back into having to deal primarily with its own backyard?
Yeah.
People are saying, now we see America back asserting itself vis-a-vis China. And I would look at that and say, well, look again. Maybe the opposite is true. Yeah. Maybe. And I think that when it comes to West Asia, when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Palestine, we need to think, all of us who care about a different future there, we need to think whether our obsession with America is excessive. We can't, yes, America has the most leverage with Israel. America is not the only relevant geopolitical player. And ultimately, Israel has gone, and this is why I mentioned this thing about Israeli overreach. Israel has gone on a path where it is now exclusively, I would say, reliant on military domination, on its military power. It has therefore laid down the gauntlet to anyone else. Can you match it on that field? Can you deter or contain Israel militarily? Yeah. And I think that touches on the Turkey issue, which you raised earlier. And I think that's the question that people are slowly, including after September 9th and the attack in Doha, are slowly coming to terms with. Wait a minute. The challenge that a zero-sum Zionism on steroids poses to this region comes down to whether we can protect ourselves and our people. And I don't think that's a clever place for Israel to be, by the way.
Bienvenue sur The Thinking Muslim. C'est un plaisir de vous avoir parmi nous.
Merci de m'avoir invité à nouveau.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وأهلا بك في برنامج المسلم المفكر.
شكرا جزيلا ومرحبا بكم في लंदन. الحمد لله.
The Thinking Muslim में आपको दोबारा खुशामदीद कहते हैं. मैं आपका आज हमारे साथ होने पर शुक्रगुजार हूँ.
देखें, ये हमेशा बहुत खुशी की बात है और सच कहूँ तो मुझे एक और थिंकिंग मुस्लिम कप लेने आना ही पड़ा क्योंकि फातिमा जो मेरे साथ काम करती हैं वो वाकई एक और कप चाहती हैं.
I've got some really exciting news for you. My guests and I now speak Urdu, Arabic and French, with the help of AI, of course. We aim to reach a larger audience and hope to dub our archive and new programs into these languages. I need you to subscribe to these channels and help spread the word. If you want to help this project, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. Danny, can I get your view on, Venezuela is a conversation that of course everyone is having at the moment. And I think there is a connection between Venezuela and Palestine, in particular when it comes to the European position, because we have seen, Wes Streeting was on Radio 4 this morning and, it was very difficult for him to find the words to even criticize mildly the American administration for breaking international law. We've seen across Europe, Ursula von der Leyen's position, President of the European Commission, has been derisory, really. It's been, a horrible position regarding Venezuela. And of course, on Gaza, we saw Merz and Keir Starmer here in the UK, who not only was silent, but actually were condoning the positions of the siege on Palestine, on Gaza, for example. Like, where do you see, I don't know if you still see yourself as a liberal who believes in this liberal world order. Where do you see the liberal world order heading, where the key nodes of this sort of so-called rules-based order are now bending over backwards to accept everything but the liberal world order?
So I think we first of all just have to interrogate that phraseology a little bit, Jalal, which is there is international law. You are either in compliance with or in violation of international law in your actions. The so-called rules-based international order, a Western invention, has always been a pathway to circumvent what is the actual multilateral architecture, which is international law. Right. So we don't need a so-called rules-based international order. We don't need a liberal order. You are either in compliance with international law or you are not. And we have a long way as the so-called liberal, law-abiding, multilateral, believing in the architecture and institutions of that system, we are consistently, and it's not an invention of the last couple of years or last couple of months, a long way from being in compliance with that. Of course, the problem is relations of power. Who can hold you to account when you are not in compliance with that? And then along came Russia, Ukraine, and shortly thereafter, October 7th, violations of international law by Hamas, no question, by militant groups, following decades of Israeli violations of international law, which went unpunished, unquestioned, and then Israel took it to a whole new level with its subsequent genocidal campaign in Gaza. And perhaps the proximity in time of these things, and perhaps the degree to which the West got on its soapbox and wagged its finger at the world, and having imposed sanctions in a way which had a very significant effect on, for instance, food security in countries that were never asked, in countries which had, in the global south, so-called especially, in countries which had witnessed Western hypocrisy. It's hardly a breaking news, hypocrisy from anyone's part. But they had witnessed this for decades, and suddenly they were being told, well, if you don't get, this is the only litmus test that matters, Russia. And so I think that Europe and the West, in the last 2-3 years, have, in such a transparent fashion, been seen to be naked in the town square, or perhaps be wearing the Joker's hat and the Joker's little pointy shoes when it comes to the unseriousness of their supposed adherence to some kind of international order. And I think along comes Venezuela, and what you've been seeing in those interviews, Radio 4 and elsewhere, for instance, in this country, but not exclusively in this country. You mentioned the genocide-promoting head of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, and German politics has been the biggest disgrace throughout this period. People don't pay attention, by the way, to the case Nicaragua brought to the International Court of Justice on German complicity in its arms trade with Israel. Close that parenthetical. But you see these interviews over what's happened in Venezuela, and for me, it's putting the bells on the hats and the pointy shoe jokers that they have become. And then you kind of catch your breath and you say, okay, you're exposed, but how does that help us? Right? What do we do with this other than kind of belly laugh, which doesn't get you anywhere? And so I think we have to take very seriously the question of what is the alternative. And for me, the alternative resides in particular two questions. And those two questions are, how do you hold that derogation of responsibility, that unwillingness to uphold international legality, the institutional multilateral architecture which we need in this world? Because if X is not held to account, then Y looks on that and says, well, I can do the same. So how do we accumulate the power? Because this is about relations of power at the end of the day. And we've seen the power of the street sometimes. Power can be in the ballot box. Power can be as a consumer in terms of what you choose to buy and not. In power in unions in certain countries, Italy and elsewhere, they have refused in docks to unload Israeli products, for instance. So A, how do we bring relations of power into play so people can't get away with this? And B, what alternative are we offering? Because I don't want to say, ha, you've been caught and now we have no rules, because that doesn't serve us. So how do you rebuild the architecture of, because the laws themselves aren't bad. It's the unwillingness to apply them fairly and universally. That's the thing here. You have an international criminal court arrest warrant against Israel's leader and former defense minister. And so you go after the court. You don't go after the criminal. You have an International Court of Justice set of provisional measures already issued in January 2024 in the South Africa genocide case vis-a-vis Israel, because Israel was suspected sufficiently of being in violation of that genocide convention that immediate provisional measures were called for. Israel totally ignored, and they were not held to account. And there have been subsequent ICJ rulings, including on the overall illegality of the occupation, on Israel's responsibilities vis-a-vis aid provision, and it's just gone after 37 aid-providing organizations even more. So how do you rebuild that architecture? And for me, what we were shown in the pyrotechnics of the weekend before we're having this conversation, Jalal, in Caracas, was you can't do this with America as your hub. And it's Europe's choice now to say, mid-level powers, risen powers. China says it wants to be an upholder of the multilateral order. Let's go with that. Let's work. We have to think about how we create a world that is going to be safer for all of us. Because if you think that the kind of robotics and AI, lavender, and the things that have been exposed that Israel has been using against Palestinians in Gaza, if you think that ends there, then you're living in cloud cuckoo land.
So Daniel, you are a believer in international law still. And this morning I was listening to a news piece, and Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, the sort of ideologue of the Trump MAGA approach to conservatism, was talking about international law. And he, I think, very candidly said, there is no real such thing as international law. What really matters is power and the projection of power. And of course, America has a lot of power. When you've got, regardless of if we argue that America is declining or not, they have all of the fancy toys. They have the weapons of war. They have what it takes to, the sort of the military and political will. And it remains to be a very powerful state. So in the absence of a declined America, as you, I think, intimated previously, do you believe that power really is all that matters in international politics?
So we've set up two things here, which is international law, but it is not self-imposing, self-actualizing. And that is the key point, that unless you have the power to enforce that law. So the ICC, as I mentioned, can issue an arrest warrant. It doesn't have it doesn't have a force that can then go out and capture the person, etc. Or the International Court of Justice can make a ruling. There's one tangent one can go on, which is these things actually open all kinds of possibilities in national jurisdictions. And you're going to see these pursued in terms of companies that might be culpable, that are going to have to defend themselves in court, individuals who might have been responsible, who might have to defend themselves in court. But the bigger picture that you're putting forward here, and that I've tried to stress, is you have to think about relationships of power. And you are right to point out that what I would argue is the clear trajectory of American decline does not mean that we can now think of American power as being residual. It is still, I'm not sure I'm going to go with the word preeminent. It is still very prevalent, though. It's very much there.
And more dangerous?
There is certainly, I think, a lot to make of the argument that says an America that refuses to acknowledge the end of unipolarity, that refuses to acknowledge multipolarity, that can't deal with that, and that is resisting how America operates in a different world, is a more dangerous beast. Partly that's what we're seeing now. I think we're also going to witness its limitations. there are crucial nodes that have been pointed out that are ever more clear to everyone. So the extent to which the US can wield the power of finance, the power of the dollar as the global reserve currency, and there are very serious efforts now to segue out of that, to de-dollarize, to shield, for countries to shield themselves from the power of the treasury, to sanction, to make you inaccessible to the global banking system. We've just seen Europe go through this whole issue of what to do with frozen Russian assets, where in the end, they decided it was financially too dangerous to deploy those in the way that the Commission had suggested. And well, member state Belgium led on that, but others came on board. So I would argue we are in an extremely tense and fluid geopolitical moment. I think one can already see what some of those outcomes are.
Yeah.
I would suggest those outcomes will not see the reassertion of unchallenged unipolar American primacy. How do you manage the interregnum? And how do you chart a course for what comes next? Those are questions which I don't necessarily feel qualified to pontificate on. What I try and wrap my head around is, what does that mean for Israel, Palestine, West Asia, Middle East, in that broader geopolitical context? We've talked about the internal disagreements in America. We've talked about Israel being a more controversial issue in America. We've talked about how America is, and with a European assist, is actually deconstructing the system which served it very well. And I think all of those things don't bode well, either for the US and certainly not for the country that is most dependent on the US. And as I've suggested, that Israel has gone off on this ever more adventurous, I'm calling it overreach. You're occupying part of Lebanon. You're occupying part of Syria. You're going out on a limb and recognizing a country that no one else has recognized in Somaliland. You're creating various zones of confrontation with Turkey, but you're sending a signal to your entire surrounding region that either you accept our military superiority and our hegemonic domination plans for this region, or we will go after you. And the gamble that you're taking, the risk you are placing as Israel is, can we pull this off? And what you're basically gambling on is that the surrounding region will not be able to cooperate sufficiently to challenge that, will not be able to get its act together, if you like, will not be able to mount either a political, an economic, or a military challenge to that it will remain dependent on America in its own ways, that its elites will pursue more of a narrow interest. Let's be honest, that's worked for you so far.
And will it work going forward?
And that's the question. And I'm not deterministic in this respect. If you ask me to put money, I would say no. But certain things need to happen in order for that no to become a reality. Can those things happen in the state system that Western colonialism created? It works very effectively.
Yeah.
Where you have, rather than thinking in pan-regional, I'll use the expression pan-Arab or pan-Islamic terms about shared interest, you have a small elite more focused on this little bit of territory and my domination of that. That's the bet Israel is placing. But what Israel is doing is it's making it harder for that system to sustain itself in those ways. Why? Because it is acting as such a destabilizing, radicalizing factor in that region.
Yeah.
When the premise you are positing is you have to accept our eradicationist position towards Palestinians, because Israel went on this journey where it tried to say, no one cares, the world's moved on, the region has moved on, Abraham Accords, normalization. You hate the Palestinians as much as we do. And what the last 2 years has proven is that at the popular level, people do not want to see on their devices Palestinians, in the case of the region, fellow Arabs perhaps, in the case of a broader region, fellow Muslims perhaps, but in a much broader sense, fellow human beings who their own governments are complicit in allowing the slaughter of. And people don't want to see that. And then Israel goes further, and it said we can bomb this capital and that capital and Doha and Damascus, Beirut. I don't think that is a sustainable project, but others will have to demonstrate the unsustainability of that project to Israel. And two crucial things beyond that is that the Palestinians will have to have a leadership that asserts a strategy and an agency which plays to the vulnerabilities Israel has created. And right now you don't have that. You have division. You have a group that is co-opted by this system running things in Ramallah. You do not have the reclaiming of a Palestinian national liberation, whatever you want to call it. And the other thing, and this is super important, you have to have an answer to what is the future for Israeli Jews as well. The way you really go further in sowing discord and giving people a sense that their own system is failing them is by showing Israeli Jews Zionism cannot bring you security, but this can. That it's not zero-sum. The alternative to Israel's zero-sum project is not our own zero-sum project, where you, Israeli Jews, you can be settler colonists, but we understand you are a community here, a national community, a collective that is going nowhere. And you are better off living under a system not of ethno-nationalist supremacy, but of equality. Super hard to do, but absolutely necessary to come forward with a project that addresses that as well.
So then let's talk about Israeli society and how it's changed over the past 2 years of mass violence. It seems to me that there is a deeper radicalization. It seems to me that there is a deeper desensitization towards violence against Palestinians. I mean, you're someone who knows Israeli society pretty intimately. Like, how do you characterize Israeli society today?
So I would agree with that description, Jalal, of the journey towards a greater dehumanization, endorsement of a project so egregiously structurally violent and destructive towards Palestinians. You can't understand that without locating it in a history. In a history of denying Palestinian rights, freedom, self-determination, of dispossession, of this journey from conducting a Nakba to denying a Nakba to never coming to terms with a Nakba to now saying we're going to do a second Nakba. Israel went from Nakba 1 to Nakba 2 without ever acknowledging. And, let's look at how the 20% of Israel's population who are Palestinian Arab, many of whom identify as such, are treated in a system of structural discrimination, of second-class citizenry. Even though Israelis are very used to going to a pharmacy or going to a hospital and being treated by a Palestinian Arab nurse, doctor. And yet, you have now experienced, drawing on that history, taking it to a new level, I would argue, You have experienced a process whereby societal consent for genocide has been manufactured. That takes some reversing. That, I mean, just to come to terms with what that means. And it does have to be reverse engineered, but you do not have, at the moment, the pieces in place to undo that. And I would argue that Israeli Jewish society does not show signs of being able to generate that from within. I would love to tell you that, with the ceasefire, perhaps with the release of the Israelis who are being held, the scales have begun to fall from enough people's eyes, and they're looking at this and they're saying, I have to know what we did there. We did this in my name. My neighbors did this. My members of my family were in the military. It's a people's military. That's not who we are. There has to be a form of reflection, truth and reconciliation, penance. When I was a negotiator, the thing that was never allowed in the room was any process of truth and reconciliation, any consideration of making whole for either side. I'd love to tell you that that is now changing. It's not. That doesn't mean that there are not corners, islands, outposts of that thinking amongst Israeli Jews, of challenging mainstream Zionist positions. It requires such a fundamental reset, because I don't know what one will call it if and when that day of change comes, but realistically, what we're seeing is that the Zionist project has proven itself incompatible with Palestinian well-being, and therefore with Jewish security. I would say it's failed to do what was written on the tin. The most dangerous place to be a Jew today, I would argue, is in Israel. The biggest danger to Jews today, I would argue, and I'm not saying there aren't dangers to Jews coming from other places. There is a historic animus that manifests itself in all kinds of ways today. I'm not an anti-Semitism denier. I'm just not someone who deploys that term in irresponsibly catch-all and intentionally devious ways. So I would argue the biggest danger to Jews today is what Israel is doing and how Israel is trying to make us all complicit in what it is doing. So I would argue that Zionism has failed fundamentally as a project to do what was written on the tin, because what was supposed to be written on the tin was not dispossess the Palestinians, it was Jewish safety and well-being. And there were different kinds of Zionism. There wasn't a state-centric Zionism as the only choice. There was binationalism. Anyway, we are where we are now. There will need to be a fundamental coming to terms with what is the best way forward. That's why I would argue that we have to offer Israeli Jews a different way forward, not a regime of militant ethno-nationalism that lives, and I would argue dies by the sword. But that's not happening yet in Israeli society. The good news is, I don't think it's going to work out. And I think if people see, and this is why what I argued about in terms of impunity, holding Israel accountable, this is why I think it matters. Because if people see that it's not working, if people see that the world doesn't treat it as normal, then they're not going to say, oh, thank you, we've just been waiting for this moment. No, they will push back, they will reject, but they will also say, what do we do? This isn't working anymore. Is it possible that we're doing something wrong? Dig up those things that we claimed were just lies and propaganda of what we did. Oh, did we really do that in Gaza? We have to come to terms with this. I don't think we're incapable of doing that as a people. But it is going to have to go through a process. It is going to have to be challenged. Israel is going to have to see that it can't get away with this. My good news is I think that's possible. My bad news is it is not on the political horizon. 2026 will be a year of elections in Israel. There is no currently conceivable outcome to that election where something fundamentally different is on the agenda, because there is no Israeli opposition to these policies. The most likely challenger to Netanyahu from the so-called opposition, most of the opposition leaders haven't challenged what's gone on in Gaza, what's going on regionally. aren't bringing a pragmatism to this. The most likely challenger is Naftali Bennett. He was prime minister for a year. He has been, he was a settler leader. People have forgotten this. Bennett was in the same party as Bezalel Smotrich. From late 2019 to early 2021, they had a party called Yamina, which is the Hebrew word for right, and they were in parliament together. They were on a slate together in an election. He is the supposed leader of the opposition. So will they put a more smiley face on the apartheid regime against Palestinians? Possibly. Do you have an audience in Western politics that's dying to lap this up? Maybe you do. Is it going to take Israel to a better place? No. Is it going to take Palestinians, the region, to a better place? No. But crucially, those whose political conscience has been awakened by what they have seen in the last 2 years, are they going to believe this? No, they are not. So it is about taking the challenge to that society to look in the mirror. You can only do that if you also have tools of leverage that get deployed, and you look at relationships of power. That's hard, but that's the journey we have to be on.
And Levy, you've provided us a very thoughtful analysis today. Thank you so much for your time.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you, Jalal. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.